Great day, everyone! Now we will tackle about the chapter 6, Monastic Supremacy, from the book of Renato Constantino. The Spanish Empire was deemed to be in the service of both majesties, which is the god and the king, so patronat real, the representation of church and state that symbolizes the altar and throne. In monastic supremacy, there is a struggle for control and jurisdiction over the Spanish church with popes. The royal authority over the Spanish church was based on king had secured from the pope the right to make nominations to most of the bishoprics and abbacies in Spain, even sa iyang dominions. The two sovereigns are spiritual and temporal. Nakapaloob dito ang nationalism and religiosity. The religious orders came to the Philippines on the strength of an understanding between the Pope in Rome and the King in Spain. Next is justification for colonization. Ang simbahan ng Espanya ay mas naging makapangyarihan and influential factor in the theopolitical enterprise that included among its ventures which is the colonization of the Philippines. Then the role of the church and its clergy. The Pope stipulated that the Spanish king as an ardent patron. The Pope recognized the king as the legitimate arm of the church. Next is clerical ascendancy. In clerical ascendancy, the church was even more completely under the king's official, but clergy were more completely powerful than king's official administrators. Friars played such an important role in pacification campaign, and in clerical ascendancy, clergy's power and wealth made priesthood an attractive career rather than a spiritual calling. Mission rivalries. Augustinians with Legazpi. They are the first religious orders in the islands, so that they tried to prevent the coming of other religious orders. Next is Franciscans, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, and the Recollects. They are assigned to different regions to prevent quarrels among them. Friar acquisition of land. First is royal bequest. Friars suggested that the king grant them some estates in the native villages so that the missionaries could become self-supporting. In royal bequest, the royal ordered that the clergy should not own lands in the Indian villages. Friars became encomenderos. Ang ibig sabihin ng encomenderos ay tagapangalaga ng katahimikan at tagapagtanggol ng mga mamamayan. Donations and inheritances. Donations to friars in gratitude for their ministrations. Down payment for a place in heaven. Priests were prohibited from inheriting property from those they have habitually confessed by order of the king. Buying of land. Ang mga tinatawag na natives ay yung mga ordinaryong mamamayan. So, friars bought land from the natives using the money obtained from church fees, trade, and from profits gained from produce of lands. With their prestige and power, they pressured natives to sell them their lands at very low prices. Foreclosure of mortgages. Native capital for extensive cultivation. Seeing that the obstacle to more extensive was lack of capital, priests entered into partnership, advancing with farmers money for them work, animals, and tools. Partnerships were informed between the farmers and friars. Friars began to demand that their advances to be regarded as loans payable at a fixed rate of interest. Farmer debt ran into debt, leading to foreclosure of lands. Property acquisition, fundamental cause for the corruption of friars. How it started? It started in contention of the religious, when Dominicans and Augustinians suggested that it would be best if the king grant them some estates in the native villages. King revoked his previous decree, and a letter to Governor Dasmariñas from Bishop Domingo Salazar obtained the revocation of royal prohibition against their owning property, exemption from the Pope from their monastic vows, opportunity to amass large tracts of land. Outright land grabbing. Usurpation or pangangamkam. Land hectares gobbled up. Additional hectares of land outside original boundaries of friar property were gobbled up each time a new survey was conducted. Priests claimed lands and had them titled. Original native settlers were declared squatters. Títulos reales. The native did not have this kind of document because they just claimed the land that was based on de facto possession. Friar abuses. Sa friar abuses, kabilang dito ang taxes, tributes, exorbitant rents, arbitrary increase, forced labor, personal services, and petty cruelties. Sidelines and other abuses, fees for all sorts of rites, baptism, and burial, native paid even if to lose their last possessions, selling of rosaries, scapulars, and other objects, offering of food, rosaries for the covenant table, corporal punishment. Girls were compelled to pound rice in convents. Many of them were raped, exempted from taxes.
Economic power. It is against the power of his friar landlord. A tenant found it impossible to prosecute his interests or having complaints heard. Commercial activities. Beside being large landowners, the clergy participated prominently in the commercial life of the country. The friars were also monopolies in the internal trade of their districts and were often powerful enough to fix the prices at which produce was to be bought and sold. Political power. The early ascendancy of the church over the state was made possibly by the success which the friars undertook almost single-handedly the pacification of the country, since this success was due in large measure at the native acceptance of the new religion. Of the church and state. Other factors contributed to friar ascendancy. The friars' knowledge of the land and of the people was invariably superior to that of the government functionary. Friar Supremacy. Friction between the two colonial authorities existed almost from the very start. It was naturally exacerbated by the growing importance and consequent arrogance and abuses of the religious authorities. Official complaints. Time and again, governors complained of the abuses of the clergy and appealed to the Spanish monarch to curtail their powers. As early as 1592, Governor Dasmariñas was already railing against friar power. Gubernational casualties, but monastic supremacy was a fact of life that the king's representatives had to live with. Those who dared oppose the religious courted humiliation and even death. Competing exploiters and oppressors. Of course, there was no lack of complaints to the king from the friars against the civil authorities. The latter's abuses and corruption were just as blatant. The dispute was between the competing oppressors and exploiters, with the king sometimes inclined to favor one and exploiters with the king to favor one and the other times the other. Conflict over land titles. To curb the land grabbing properties of the friars, the king ordered at various times the examination of land titles. Such as investigation had minimal effect, for the some religious orders either land titles or simply refused to show evidence or ownership, claiming ecclesiastical immunity from the individual to common grievance. During the early years of Spanish rule, most of the abuses committed by the friars were incidental to their proselytization and their role in resettling their converts in more compact communities. Transformation of consciousness. But when the religious orders began to acquire property, their abuses took on different complexion. As landlords, they became economic exploiters whose abuses threatened. The economic ascendancy of the friars not only gave rise to the new form of awakening, it also became an additional factor to unifying the people. From accessory to principal apparatus, to summarize the attitude of the natives to the church in the course of its economic and political ascendancy changed from initial obedience through to awe and fear. to loyalty and subservience arising from acceptance of the Catholic religion and experience with the power of priests within the generalized or group hostility because of the common experience with economic exploitation by the friars, and finally to the violently anti-friar sentiments of the masses during the Revolution. Indigenous church, it is very clear that this transformation in the realm of consciousness was a response to a material stimulus. The transformation of the church, a colonial accessory to the principal apparatus of colonial appropriation and exploitation.